Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Just confirming that you see my full slides here, right? Okay. So just to give you a little bit of background in terms of how I got into this. I mean, my training from as an undergrad, as a graduate student, I was always interested in money and banking and macroeconomic questions. I never thought that the rest of my career will be focused on climate change related issues, on agriculture, on renewable energy, or on reparations. But I think this is relevant, especially to graduate students who are drawn to interesting questions that, one thing leads to another. And as long as you're motivated by the thirst for finding meaningful, impactful policy solutions, I think the sky's the limit in terms of how you see the interconnections. And what you'll see in this presentation is kind of part of my journey, kind of connecting the dots between some of the big issues that we deal with and that we can't ignore anymore. I mean, when I teach intermediate macro, I can't kind of live with myself if I don't bring in climate change issues and just talk about economic growth, which is insane these days. So with that, let me try to zap through this presentation and hopefully give you as much time as possible to engage with questions and follow up. But please feel free to interrupt me during the presentation with questions as needed. So let's see, why is this not moving? There you go. So first I want to start with what most developing countries struggle with. The focus here is going to be on the global south in particular. I can give you the 1 minute about the global north. The US, Canada, Europe, Japan, all these countries should have Green New Deals, should have had their Green New Deals to massively decarbonize the system, address structural inequality, 10, 20, 30 years ago. But here we are, 30 years later, we're still here. My concern is about the global south. So first, I'll start with the structural economic deficiencies. I'll walk you through these in the next few minutes, and then highlight why it's important to rebalance the global economic and financial system in order to allow the global south actually to participate in the decarbonization and structural reparations of these broken structures. So number one, most developing countries have a massive external debt burden. And when I say external debt, I mean debt denominated in foreign currencies. So think of every government having essentially two components of its national debt. One denominated in the national currency, and that, as I will argue later, is something that any country can manage. But most importantly, debt denominated in dollars and euros and Japanese yen and British pounds for countries in the global south, that's the unmanaged, unsustainable debt. And I argue that it's structural, that it's very hard to undo the burden of that external debt. And the root causes of that external debt have to do with structural trade deficits in the global south that can be identified in three key areas. One is energy deficits. That is reliance on imported energy for fueling the economy, for transportation, heating and cooling, and so on. Number two, food deficits. Most countries in the global south, after the end of colonialism, became net importers of food. And in some cases, countries not after colonialism, but after signing free trade agreements with the global north, became net food importers. Mexico here is a case in point. It used to be a net food exporter to the US. After NAFTA became a net food importer. And then third, and most importantly, the type of industrialization the developing countries specialized in is low value added type of manufacturing. In other words, you have countries that import all the components, the capital equipment, the intermediate goods, and simply rely on low-cost labor to produce assembly line type of manufacturing. So you import high value-added content and you export low value-added content. And because you're competing with 100 some other developing countries, you race to the bottom in terms of labor standards, in terms of pay, in terms of environmental standards and regulation. So you end up really racing to the bottom, and that's one of the key areas. I'll make one point about energy deficits. This is also true for developing countries who are massive exporters of oil, including countries like Venezuela or oil and gas, I should say, or even Saudi Arabia or Nigeria. Why? Because these countries export crude oil, which is the low value added content, and then import or re-import the refined petrochemicals that they need, which is gasoline and kerosene and diesel and all the other petrochemicals we use for manufacturing, for painting, for plastics, for all kinds of things. So it's again that structural issue where you export low value added content, you import high value added content, which means you're constantly getting into the structural trade deficit trap, which at the end of every year translates into downward pressure on your currency. So your currency is losing value relative to the dollar, to the euro, to the British pound, and so on. And when your currency weakens, and the next morning you have to import food for your people, or medicine, or medical equipment, or fuel to fuel your economy, all of those imports with the weaker currency translate into imported inflation. This is what we call the pass-through inflation effect, which means you literally have the potential of facing food riots, which many countries in the global south experience frequently. So now the government, in order to prevent social and political unrest, the government has to artificially fix the exchange rate at a relatively high value relative to the dollar and euro and so on. And the way we do that is by acquiring more external debt to stabilize the value of the currency. So we temporarily protect the economy from that inflation effect, but structurally, we're getting into long-term external debt that you can't pay off simply by issuing your own currency. So now you have to turn your entire economic policy framework into an obsession with earning dollars. And I'll walk you through how most countries do this. So a little bit of a kind of recap of how we got into where we are today. Most countries after independence followed kind of a Keynesian type state-led economic development. They followed import substitution industrialization. The problem is that you have countries like Japan and Korea and Singapore and Taiwan and so on specializing in import substitution and industrialization that led them to high value added content of manufacturing. But the majority of the global south pursued import substitution industrialization that focused on low value added manufacturing, in addition to layers of corruption and so on, which I will not go into today. The 1970s was a period of export-led growth. And this was a period where we actually began to see the impact of that low value added kind of manufacturing. And country after country, as soon as you open the economy to export-led growth, you realize that you start importing even more than what you export. This is where the structural trade deficits started to build up in the 1970s. And that led to the debt crisis, because in order to kind of plug the holes of that structural trade deficit, countries started to accumulate massive amounts of external debt. The mid-1980s was the global debt crisis for the global south in general, and that ushered in the quote unquote help from the IMF and the World Bank via the structural adjustment program. So financial aid or loans were restructured and stretched over several decades under the conditions that neoliberal free trade type of economic policies are implemented. And that started in the 1990s. And I'll go through the list of those policies that became kind of the standard policies to help countries in the global south, presumably accelerate the pace at which they earn dollars or euros and foreign currencies to pay their debt and to fuel economic development. And I'll argue that the solutions that were introduced by structural adjustment programs are actually deeper traps that trap developing countries in that model. So austerity was the standard policy that the government needs to try as much as possible to balance its books the same way a company or a household does, and needs to reduce its deficit, reduce its debt, restructure the debt, privatize some state-owned enterprises. So we went through a long wave of privatization in the 90s, and especially in the global south, where governments were told you need to sell the airport, the airlines, the electric company, the railroads, all major industries that used to be owned and controlled by the government are now sold. Now, the advantage of doing this, presumably, is that you get foreign investors with dollars who now bring those dollars to you so you can pay your debt, so you can, finance your structural trade deficit and finance economic development. The problem is you can't privatize the airline twice. Once you sell it, that's it. You get those $500 million and you spend them, and then you're trapped. So that's gone. A key feature of structural adjustment is labor market flexibility, which is code word for lower wages, lower labor standards, a race to the bottom, in other words, not sustainable. Foreign direct investment, try to fuel your export-led growth by attracting foreign companies, say outsourcing from the US or France or Germany to countries in the global south. The problem with this is that the only kind of FDI you're going to attract is also going to be the low value added assembly line. You're racing to the bottom in terms of labor and environmental standards and wages and so on. So it's, again, further trap. Financial liberalization, set up a mini Wall Street to attract financial investment. Well, it creates this hot money phenomena where you attract investors to your stock market, to your financial market, by deregulating the market, by offering artificially higher rates of return than the global north, by lowering your taxes. So you end up essentially attracting speculators. And we've seen this in Mexico and South Korea and South Africa and Turkey and Brazil and other places. Lots of money comes in, buy low and sell high, and then you have a crash in your stock market, a crash in the currency market, and then you're left kind of picking up the pieces for the next 10 years in terms of dealing with the consequences. Not sustainable. Tourism, we're told that tourism brings hundreds of millions of dollars to countries in the global south. The problem is, the more tourists you bring to your country, you have to feed them, which means you import food, and you have to transport them, heat and cool the hotels for them, which means you import even more energy. So that's, again, part of that structural trap that I talked about earlier in terms of food deficits and energy deficits are further exacerbated with this presumed solution that is tourism. The energy deficit is further exacerbated with export-led growth, especially if you specialize in energy-intensive type of manufacturing. So it seems like a short-term solution because you bring millions of tourists, you create jobs in the hotel industry, restaurant industry, which is great. You create some manufacturing units, you support hundreds of families with jobs and income, but in the long term, you're trapped in that structural problem. Remittances, we're told if you send your workers abroad, they send money back home, right? The problem is this fuels brain drain, especially with restrictions on immigration. So again, it's a long-term structural problem for developing countries. You can't rely on remittances to fuel economic growth. So you end up with the race to the bottom, more external debt, and we're told that there is no alternative. Well, to me, the only alternative to this is to go back to the roots of the problem, which are, sorry to go back to the previous page here, which is to address the energy deficit, meaning you invest in domestic renewable energy production, especially in this day and age. You invest in food sovereignty, you invest in food security so that you plug that major pressure point on your external balance. And you invest in education, infrastructure, research and development, vocational training, technical training, so that you over time specialize in higher value added content of manufacturing. And none of the standard policies that we've followed in the last 30, 40 years have placed an emphasis on these issues. And my argument is that today, not only we have to do it for climate change reasons, for food security reasons and energy security reasons, but we have to do this for economic structural improvement reasons that I want to highlight here. The big question becomes, how do we pay for this? for this massive transformation. So here I wanted to highlight just one example, and I can show you dozens of developing countries. This is the case of Bolivia, in which you see major exports focusing on essentially extractive industries. And then you flip the page and you look at imports, it's the higher value added content. So it's, you know, country after country, you look at, compare the exports, you compare the imports, you can kind of eyeball the structural problems right there. Globally, if we take the whole world and divide it into two groups, the global south and the global north, and you net out all the transactions, what we see as of, this is I think 2017, the latest data we have, or 2018, what we have is the global south is literally sending $2 trillion to the global north. So when we talk about foreign aid, when we talk about charity, all of this is included, by the way, here. The net impact is literally extraction of $2 trillion annually from the global south. So we're not going to fix climate change. We're not going to fix inequality. We're not going to fix anything if we're constantly extracting wealth from the global south. This is what we refer to as the neo-colonial extractive system. During colonialism, it was, you know, open in broad daylight. There was extraction, right? But now, during the post-colonial, you know, supposedly independent countries, we have an economic and financial system that extracts wealth. And notice the wealth extraction is accelerating. It's not like constant. It started to get worse as we accelerated the free trade agreements in the 1990s and 2000s. So this has to be reversed somehow. We're not going to deal with climate change or any of these structural problems if we're handing out a few $1 billion in foreign aid and then pulling $2 trillion at the same time, kind of giving with one hand and taking with the other. So to me, that picture needs to be reversed somehow. And what I argue for is that reversing this flow can be done via colonial reparations and climate reparations. And I'll explain what I mean by colonial and climate reparations. So you've seen this picture. You know, this is global income distribution. This is unsustainable socially, politically, ethically. We can't have a functioning planet if we have a picture like this, or if we have a picture like this. So the $2 trillion, if we have this conversation in 5 years or 10 years under the current, you know, at the current pace, that number might be 5, 6, maybe $10 trillion. That is unsustainable. Again, politically, economically, ethically, and environmentally, it's unsustainable. We know that the extreme concentration of wealth that we have globally also maps almost perfectly with CO2 emissions. Is concentrated at the top, is concentrated in the global north. Not just via emissions, but also via the carbon footprint of consumption items that are produced in India and China and the global south, but then consumed in the global north. So it's not about where the emissions actually take place. It's about who's consuming the embedded CO2 carbon footprint, and it's mostly in the global north. So how do we pay for this? Can we afford a global Green New Deal? And this is where MMT, modern monetary theory, comes in to give us an idea about what governments can afford. Because the standard economic policy framework, mainstream economics, tells us that governments have limited budgets and they can't really address all of these issues. Well, the MMT analysis that I'll show here shows us that we can actually afford massive global Green New Deals with reparations for climate and colonial damage. So MMT highlights that different countries have different degrees of monetary sovereignty. So you can think of countries on this end of the spectrum with the highest degree of monetary sovereignty. That includes the US, Canada, Japan, the UK, and so on. And the opposite end of the spectrum, you have countries that completely gave up or lost their monetary sovereignty. Ecuador would be a great example here because it's a country that literally dollarized its economy and uses a foreign currency. So it doesn't have any monetary sovereignty to speak of. But most countries are somewhere in between. Developing countries are somewhere in between. What determines where you are on that spectrum is how much external debt you have. That weakens your monetary sovereignty, and also determines how desperately you need to fix your exchange rate to the dollar or to the euro. The more desperate you are at fixing your exchange rate, the closer you are to the weaker degree of monetary sovereignty. And most of my work is really about how can we design policies to help countries acquire higher degrees of monetary sovereignty, and as a result, acquire higher degrees of resilience to these external shocks. So that's really the one of the main points. What MMT highlights is that monetary sovereignty is not something that you declare. The president shows up on TV and says, we have monetary sovereignty. It's something that you earn through hard work, through strategic policies. And when you have a high degree of monetary sovereignty, you're a country that issues its own currency. Check, a country like the US does that. You're a country that collects taxes in the national currency. Check, the US does that. But three, and most importantly, you're a country that doesn't borrow and promise to pay back in foreign currencies. In other words, your entire national debt is denominated in your national currency. So no external debt. And then as a result of that, if you have no external debt, then you're not desperate to fix your exchange rate to foreign currencies or to gold or anything else. So that's kind of the goal. The goal is to acquire the highest possible degree of monetary sovereignty. And I'll talk about how we can achieve that. So the key distinction that MMT brings to the table is distinguishing the issuer of the currency, which is the national government, versus the rest of us users of the currency. That is you and I, consumers, businesses, nonprofits. We have to earn our income in order to spend. We can borrow a little bit from a bank or from a friend, but then that debt, we have to pay it, work hard and pay it either by working longer hours, earning more money, cutting our spending. Somehow we need to pay for it. That is true for states and municipalities at the local level. But the national government, the federal government, is a sovereign issuer of its own currency. It doesn't face the same constraint that you and I face. So in other words, when we talk about national policy and MMT, don't try this at home. This is for sovereign governments, not for your local municipality, not for your business, obviously. So mainstream economics tells us that the spending capacity of the national government is limited by how much we can tax and how much we can borrow. But MMT says, wait a minute, there's this additional spending capacity that we're not tapping into, that bright yellow space. And that additional spending capacity is not infinite. It's not unlimited. It's constrained, as you can see, by that red bar. And that red bar is the risk of inflation. That's what tells us how much additional space we have. And this additional space varies from country to country. As I'll show, for countries in the global north, they have a much larger spending capacity. And for countries in the global south, it's very limited. Now, that spending capacity, as I'll show in a minute, can be expanded and can be forced to shrink depending on how we operate our economy. So that risk of inflation is determined by two key factors. One is the lack of productive capacity. In other words, if we run out of productive material, technology, inputs, skilled labor, then additional spending will cause inflation because we have a shortage of productive capacity. The good news about productive capacity is that it's producible. We can train more people, we can build more hospitals, we can innovate new technology. And when we do that, we actually expand that additional spending capacity and we create millions of jobs. So part of a Green New Deal design is to find those areas where you have shortages and bottlenecks of productive capacity and invest strategically to expand the productive capacity. That's one potential risk of inflation. That's actually the easier one to deal with. The second one is much more complicated, which has to do with abusive market power. In other words, when you have key corporations who can raise prices simply because they can or because we let them, then that kind of inflation pressure, think of pharmaceutical companies in the US, think of oil and gas companies, energy companies, telecom companies in some countries, including here in the US. All of these companies can raise prices because of high degrees of market concentration. And that kind of inflation risk is not going to be eliminated by imposing austerity on the public and not fighting climate change. That kind of inflation risk can be eliminated only by taxing and regulating their market power out of existence. And that becomes a question of democracy. Do we enforce antitrust laws? Do we have governments of the people, by the people, for the people, or governments of the corporations for the corporations? So that becomes a question of democracy, of justice. And if we successfully democratize those markets, make them more competitive, less monopolistic, then we essentially expand that additional spending capacity and push the inflation risk further out. So that's how you implement successful Green New Deals at the national level. You can't do it just by spending randomly. You have to spend strategically, and you have to tax and regulate strategically. And I'll keep coming back to these points. So that is the paradigm shift that MMT brings to the discussion. Whereas the mainstream approach keeps us limited in that tax and spend and borrow and spend, which by design limits how much you can do and ignores the power structure that you have in the system. So the big thing about the inflation that MMT highlights here, as you can see, is very different than the mainstream approach. So what have mainstream economists been telling us about inflation in the last 10 years? The Fed and the ECB and the Bank of Japan have openly admitted in the last few years that we pretty much have no idea what causes inflation. We thought that quantitative easing, big government deficits, large national debts will cause inflation. But we have negative interest rates, we have low levels of inflation. Look at Japan, the highest debt to GDP ratio in the world, 266% right now, with negative interest rates and deflation for the last 30 years. So the standard approach to inflation is not making any sense. Here's the ECB inflation forecast versus actual forecast. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's laughable in terms of what the theory says, what the mainstream approach is looking at versus what the reality is. So MMT is providing a different framework, and I think much more accurate analytical framework for dealing with inflation and inflation risks. So what MMT as a result tells us, at the national level, we need to decouple spending from taxation, because we spend on national priorities. That includes fighting climate change, health, education, infrastructure, whatever the national priorities are in a democratic society. But then we tax, not because we need revenues at the national level, but you tax pollution to decarbonize, you tax speculation to stabilize the economy, you tax extreme wealth to protect democracy from oligarchical abusive market power and so on, not because we need their money or their permission, but because we need to achieve these important goals. So you tax to reduce excessive wealth and abusive market power. These are the goals of taxation. And you spend based on the strategic vision that I highlighted earlier. You expand productive capacity, you tax and regulate to democratize the market, and as a result, acquire additional spending capacity. So I'll close with what happens in the global south. Countries that have very limited fiscal spending capacity and have no chance of decarbonizing or accelerating a transition to a green economy. I argue for colonial and ecological reparations. I'll start with ecological reparations. Number one, the data is very clear. What are the countries that are most responsible for the climate damage that we have today? From the Industrial Revolution to this day, it's clearly the global north. It's not the global south that caused this problem. So polluters pay. That's a major principle that all countries in the UN system have agreed to. Polluters pay, meaning transfer of financial resources to the global south, but also transfer of technology. So reparations financially and in kind. And any framework for reparations starts with, number one, telling the truth. And we have a model for this, Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. It's kind of a restorative justice type of system. It's not a court where we're going to take half the world and send them to prison at the end of the process. It's about telling the truth. This can be in the framework of national TRCs. For slavery, for dictatorship, we have lots of models for this after the Nazi regime in Germany, after genocides in many parts of the world, in Tunisia, my own home country, after the revolution. So we know how to do Truth and Reconciliation Commissions and get the truth out about colonial damage and about ecological damage. Number two, for reparations, you need a formal apology, acknowledging that damage and earning and taking responsibility. And the third one is the actual reparations, which, as I said earlier, involves monetary compensation to countries in the global south, but monetary compensation without changing the structure that sucks $2 trillion a year doesn't do very much, because we'll give you a little bit of money and then a few years later it's all going to be sucked back out, and you're not changing the structure of the global financial system and so on. So we need structural reparations that undo the extractive nature of the global financial system and international trade system. And that starts with debt cancellation, that starts with global financial system reform, which UNCTAD has been calling for years. And UNCTAD specifies in its framework for a global Green New Deal, if you looked at it, they exclusively focus on rebalancing the global financial system. And it has to do with global climate mitigation, as in transfer of technology, exemption of patents for use of technology in the global south. In the global south, I see that as part of reparations in terms of transfer of technology, but also taxing and regulating market power globally. We're not going to undo these structures, extractive structures, unless we democratize the way we run the global economy, the way we run it at the national level as well. So a framework that's worth looking at is the People's Agreement in Bolivia, in Cochabamba in 2010, which is an alternative kind of climate reparations framework that the global community needs to look into. This is just a key quote here. We, the people attending this conference on climate change and the rights of Mother Earth in Bolivia, demand that countries that have overconsumed the atmospheric space to acknowledge their historic and recurrent responsibilities for the causes and adverse effects of climate change, and to honor their climate debts to developing countries, to vulnerable communities in their own countries. So this is not reparations to people in the global south only. People in the global north, also in the most vulnerable communities, have been abused and have been victims of climate change and victims of slavery in the US and so on. And to restore a global ecological and economic balance. So there's quite a bit of literature making the case that the global north owes a climate debt to the global south. A final word on intellectual property rights. We have centuries of intellectual contributions and scientific innovations by many civilizations, from India, from Persian civilization, Muslim civilization in the Middle East, African civilization, and so on, and indigenous civilizations throughout the world. So it's not like intellectual property rights started with capitalism when we privatized the commons. There's intellectual contributions that we built our modern world on, but we never paid for, we never acknowledged. In many cases, it was pure theft. And that theft continues to this day via appropriation of scientific knowledge from indigenous communities, especially via biopiracy, and the pharmaceutical agribusiness industry is culpable of many violations in this space. Indigenous knowledge, cultural heritage. I mean, imagine what happens if I design nice shirts or jeans that I copied the designs from Gucci or any of the fancy, Italian or French designers. I'll get sued to death. I'll have to pay for. I'll go to prison, right? But if I copy the design of indigenous people in Bolivia, indigenous people in North Africa, indigenous people in Ghana, and I sell it and privatize the profits in the global north, people will celebrate how beautiful the designs are, and but you never paid for the cultural appropriation, for the scientific, for the wisdom that you've appropriated, whether it's in the scientific space or cultural space or fashion design space. So there's a case to be made for reparations related to all of this kind of intellectual property rights violations. And to conclude here, we have less than 10 years to go in terms of what the IPCC told us. The climate crisis, the inequality, poverty, exclusion, all of this injustice, all of these crises call for bold and transformative actions. So it's not sufficient to have a Green New Deal in the US. It's not sufficient to have a Green New Deal in Europe. It's not sufficient to have it in Japan. We need to rebalance the entire system with bold transformative policies. And the current climate policies, the jobs policies, are too weak, too slow, too expensive, ineffective, and dangerous in the long term. From a social, political, ecological standpoint, the status quo is unaffordable. So for me, a global Green New Deal with climate and colonial reparations is possible, desirable, and affordable, because the global North is not only responsible for climate and colonial damage, but it also has the firepower financially, the additional spending capacity to afford it. The global North has the technology, has the research and development capabilities, and has the financial resources to do it without bankrupting countries, without causing hyperinflation. We just need to get to it. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions and engage with you in the next 30 minutes or so that we have. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was very useful, and it was exactly, in my opinion, at least, the kind of conversations that we need to have with respect to this exhausting sort of like, we can't do it, we can't afford to pay for it, we can't. I'm just exhausted listening to this. It's really refreshing to hear this side of the conversation, and to have discussions around it, because like anything, this is not foolproof, but it's a step ahead. And the problem is, today it isn't, we're already late, and the rate at which the global South is at the receiving end of these damages is something that is real. And for people who are from the global South, we see it on a daily basis. It's not that's coming 2 years from now or 3. It is there. I mean, loss of agricultural land, loss of resources. These are real problems that are just there, and we can't just keep our eyes shut and pretend it will go away. So I'm sorry, but yeah, it was just something we really need to talk about. So of course, Dr. Kaboub has presented this really good point of view. So if anyone has questions, this is the time to raise your hand. So I'll just be moderating, in the sense that I'll just please raise your hands, and I'll just say, so and so can go ahead. So I see Abby and Jonathan to begin with. So would you like to unmute yourself? And
yeah, so I'm writing my senior research paper on universal basic income, and I'm talking a lot about like qualitative economic growth measure, which we also had another webinar on that topic before. And so my question is if you think like this includes the transformation to those values, because I read the article you wrote with the Tax Justice Network, and you talk about like the importance of renewable energy and investing in things like education and other things that are included in qualitative growth measurements. So I just wanted to know if like your perspective on this transformation from like includes quantitative measurements to qualitative measurements, or if you think that like there should be distinguishing factors in GDP from positive growth factors and negative growth factors, which are both included in the measurement.
Very good question. So absolutely. I mean, if I had more time, I would have added the slides about GDP versus GPI, Genuine Progress Indicator, which should be the right metric for us to use, because GDP, as you know, includes all the bad stuff that we want to get rid of. So the more pollution we have, the more people get cancer, the more people get asthma, sicknesses. All the money we spend on medication, on cancer treatment, shows up in GDP as positive numbers, gets celebrated as economic growth, but it's not improving our quality of life, right? So GPI is like the closest cousin to GDP, because it starts with the GDP numbers and then removes all of those negative effects of, environmental cleanup, all the, necessary evils, as they say. And then you get a pure measure of quality of life, which for many countries in the global North has been flat for the last several decades, and in some cases deteriorating, which is what people actually feel a deterioration in quality of life. But GDP tells you the opposite story, tells us that everything is improving. So that's number one. Number two, from an MMT perspective at the national level, because we demonstrate we have this additional spending capacity, a lot of people move quickly to say, oh, then we need universal basic income to get rid of poverty and kind of the evil abusive power of employers who abuse their workers and underpay them and so on. I see the, I'm okay with the motivation behind this, but my preference is for the following. For number one, at the national level, is what I call universal public services. That is health, education, infrastructure, all of those things. And that will absorb quite a bit of employment. We need people to build those things, right? Number two, the second layer is a job guarantee for people who actually want to work. And we have millions of people around the world who want to work. And lots of work needs to be done in terms of climate mitigation, right, for the green transition. And number three is what I call a generous income support system for people who can't work or people who shouldn't work. And this way, and this we can afford in countries that have large spending capacity and so on. And countries that don't can acquire the larger spending capacity via the strategies that I described earlier. But I'm uncomfortable with proponents who say universal basic income only and all the other problems somehow will get resolved. So it's not either or, it's these three layers that we need to apply strategically. And to be honest, globally, the planet is on fire. We have great technology that's getting cheaper, more efficient, and we have millions of people who actually want to work. And so we need to capitalize on that for accelerating the green transition. UBI alone will not do it. You'll find tons of studies, especially in the global south, saying, look, we went to this village and we give this village a basic income, and this other village, we didn't give them a basic income, and we compared the outcomes. And guess what? Nutrition improved, quality of life improved, all of these things improved, education improved for the families that we gave, $50 a month to. Well, of course, I could have told you that. If somebody's living in extreme poverty, give them $50 a month, of course they're going to have better nutrition, then their kids are going to do better at school. So I don't see those as kind of the slam dunk studies that tell us we need UBI and UBI alone. And when you survey people, people actually want to work, because work is not just income, it's the dignity of work, it's the learning, it's being involved. There's lots of literature related to this. So, and in terms of improvement of quality of life, to go back to your earlier point, we see a substantial improvement in quality of life, not just in terms of happiness, but in terms of health, and especially mental health, when people are working, but when people are working not in miserable conditions, underpaid and abused conditions. So it's really about reimagining work and raising the standard across the board, as opposed to racing to the bottom, which is what we've been doing. So all of these nuances taken together, I think we know which way we need to go. And there's no reason for us to leave anybody behind, whether it's via jobs or income support. We know we can afford this.
Thank you.
Professor Hale, I thought you had no? Okay, sorry. All right.
I see Luciana is raising
Luciana has raised her hand. Yes, go ahead.
Digital hand.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Escuta. You just don't want me to speak. Well, I mean, thank you, Professor, for this talk. It was very interesting. I have two main questions, and both of them relate to one another. So one of them is like, what would you say that is the role of circular economy as we're trying to like make that switch towards like, I mean, especially in developing countries, like how can they do that? And then tying to that question is also, there's a big debate about digital green economy as well. And in your opinion, who would be in charge of, especially in developing countries, like training and specializing labor, like workers there that don't have the opportunity to have, the education of like, I don't know, like going into renewable energy or things like that is more complicated, that they don't have access to for a circular economy to occur in their countries?
Very good question. So my point about reparations, as in not just financial reparations, but structural reparations, repairing the broken structures, is exactly addressing those concerns, because under the current model, the austerity model of the World Bank and the IMF, we're specifically telling countries to not invest in the things that will actually get them out of the trap, which is education, health, infrastructure. These are expensive, long-term resources that are absolutely necessary for the transition out of this trap. And the policies that we have right now are precisely telling them you can't do that, or you can't do it on a large scale. You can't afford it. So reparations means financial, number one, debt cancellation for the global south. Number two, financial transfers to reverse the true $1 trillion to help developing countries, address the structural trade deficit problems, at least temporarily. But then the most important ones are the structural reparations, where you actually build the resilient infrastructure in agriculture, in energy, in medical services, so that you can't run an economy without food, you can't run an economy without energy, period. So those are kind of the basic foundations. And then you follow with health and additional infrastructure. And now we have this opportunity to do this in a circular economy framework, right? Because we're not going to repair any of this damage if we keep extracting. I'll give you one example. If we decide we're going to solarize the planet based on today's technology, it's going to be a disaster, because today's technology is great. It can get us far, but it can't address the main problems that we have. Why? Because we don't even know what we're going to do with the solar panels that we're installing today. In 40 years, when they become obsolete, what we're going to do with the toxic waste embedded in them? Is it going to go into landfills? And if we scale up the production of solar technology today at the current pace, it's going to be a disaster in terms of extractive resources in the global south, ecological disaster, and so on. So it's good, but it's not good enough. What we want is billions of dollars invested in research and development, especially in material science research, specifically to build a circular economy, so that every item we buy from the store comes with a little user manual that it comes with now, but that user manual needs to include not only pages, but actually the infrastructure behind it that says, here's my living will. Here's how you dispose of me when you're done with the toxic stuff that's built into my cell phone, into these batteries and all that. And we need to build the infrastructure, the entire economic infrastructure that doesn't put the burden of recycling the product on the consumer, but creates an entire ecosystem where all products re-enter the circular economy in a new world. We have none of that set up, none of that designed as we speak. We have frameworks and models for it. And Kate Raworth's work, if you're familiar with her book, Donut Economics, gives us the design for how we build cities and how we redesign manufacturing to produce a circular economy. We just haven't done it yet. So for me, a Green New Deal, whether at the national level or global level, can't really fully be successful without that big push in research and development to create a truly circular economy. Otherwise, we're really not fixing any of this in the long term. So very good question.
Simon, did you want to go next? And then Peyton after Simon?
Thank you very much for your presentation, and I agree very much with what you've been saying, and I saw at least that in your articles as well that your idea behind this, is to get the discussion started. So inevitably, my next question is how do we go on from here? How do we convince, or what are the actors that we involve, and how do we convince developed countries to finally pay their fair share? Because I mean, you mentioned it yourself, the last 30, 40 years ago, we should have had Green New Deals in the global north. And if you just take something, as simple as the DAC OECD target of 0.7% of GNI as aid for OECD countries, for example, which was set in the 1970s and to this day has not been achieved by most countries. Sure. Giving money, how do you convince basically the global north to finally Sure. start doing this and move forward with this?
Very good question. I mean, compare that number to the $2 trillion, right? It's laughable, right? But also the Green New Deals that we're seeing, whether it's the American or the European, what do you guys call it in Europe? Green Deal, the European Green Deal. It's 1% of GDP over the next 10 years. It's like fighting a forest fire with water pistols. You're not going anywhere with that kind of intervention. So how do we convince the global north? Number one is what I presented today, the fact that this is unsustainable. The system will break ecologically, economically. But number two, which makes me a little bit more optimistic in an awkward way, which is financial markets are panicking about climate change. Finally, I'm talking literally the last 2 years. When the IPCC report came out, all the major investment banks on Wall Street started doing their own internal analysis. Why? Because they realized that there are financial risks currently on their books that will explode or implode eventually. So JP Morgan came out with the first report, and they said that IPCC report, those guys are optimistic. It's actually much worse than that. And then BlackRock came out with its own report, and all the other major banks, and they started applying pressure on central banks, on the ECB, on the Fed. The Basel Committee now has a climate change committee, and they're trying to figure out how do we mitigate these massive financial risks that are currently on the books. This is what we call the carbon bubble, and estimates are anywhere between 20, $30 trillion to 100 plus trillion dollars. Meaning, as climate change accelerates, if you look at coastal properties around the world, right, hotels and resorts and properties that are worth trillions of dollars, when they're flooded, they're worth zero. Right, so no insurance company will insure a property that's at risk of disappearing, and no bank will finance a mortgage or refinance a mortgage for a property, and no fund manager will invest a pension fund or any financial resources in hotel resorts and companies that are facing massive losses in the next 20, 30 years with the impact of climate change. And that's just coastal properties, right? In California, we already have insurance companies refusing to insure properties. They're saying, there's gonna be a fire here eventually. We're not gonna foot the bill for this. So this is putting so much pressure on financial regulators. So in Europe, there's a network that started a few years ago called NGFS, which is the Network for Greening the Financial System. It's a fantastic resource. Tons of ideas proposed to green the financial system to mitigate the risk of these stranded assets that are worth trillions now and will be worth nothing in the future. All of these are sitting right now on the balance sheets of banks, insurance companies, pension funds, trillions of dollars that will go poof with the impact of climate change. So the Fed now has a climate change committee. The European Central Bank just finished hiring a climate change director who will be, I think, the #2 person at the ECB, reporting only to the president. So they're taking it seriously. They're panicking, which means they want to do something about it. My problem is they're going to do the minimal mitigation to protect their balance sheets. They're not going to do the reparations, the climate action that I'm talking about. And I think that's why it's important to mobilize people on the streets and the climate movement and the social justice movement, so that the global Green New Deals we get are not brought to you by an insurance company or an investment bank. They're actually truly transformative in the way we've addressed it today. I think it's helpful to have them panic and do something, because now they're putting pressures on the Biden administration, on European governments, elsewhere, to actually mitigate these risks. And they're thinking simply mitigating risk with infrastructure and with a little bit of financing green transition. I think the Basel Committee, of all places, and the SEC and the Fed can do transformative action much faster than parliaments and prime ministers today. I'll give you an example, just in terms of the reserve requirements, the capital adequacy requirements. Those of you who studied accounting or finance, these are requirements that banks must have in order to withstand a financial shock, right? Those are packed with climate risks right now. If we design a new capital adequacy ratios or requirements and divide them into two, let's call them green versus brown, and you lower the capital requirements on green assets, more resilient assets, climate change resilient assets, and you raise the brown capital ratio requirements, all of a sudden you make investments in green technology and infrastructure much more attractive financially, and you make the other investments less attractive, so you help decarbonize the system simply by playing the incentives in the financial system. Another thing that central banks can do, which many central banks are considering now, is green quantitative easing, where the central bank can lean on the green bonds markets, green municipal bond markets in particular, to help cities at the local level accelerate the transition at a lower cost. because the Fed can lower the cost of borrowing if they wanted to today. They don't have to wait for any policy change. The ECB is already planning green, what do they call it? Climate stress testing, which is the usual stress testing, except trying to figure out how much brown stuff do you have built into your capital adequacy ratios that will blow up because those cushions are fake, right? With the impact of climate change, your capital will shrink if you have a bunch of stranded assets on your balance sheets. So there's lots and lots of ideas. NGFS has a massive database of ideas and solutions, and central bankers are sifting through them right now, you know, in a panic, trying to figure out what's the best and most reasonable way to do this without upsetting their Wall Street friends.
Thank you, Peyton, and then Snellen.
And I see John also raising his actual hand, not digital. Yeah,
I can't
go ahead,
find
please.
my hand. It was there and now it's gone.
And I see Skander also raising his hand. So go ahead, whoever's first. I lost track.
Peyton, why don't
Yeah, I'll ask real quick. So I was wondering, so when you're talking about culture, colonial reparations, this essentially means the transfer of technology. And I'm curious how you envision doing that, because Professor Dasgupta and I were talking about this earlier. It's not like the transfer of innovative technology is going to come out of the benevolence of the global north. So how do you see practically this transfer of technology, including a consideration of intellectual property rights?
Absolutely. Very good question. So one way to quantify this, because eventually we need to develop a metric for this, which is starting, for example, with the climate reparations. I think it's the easier to quantify because we have carbon emissions since the Industrial Revolution, and we know who did it, and we can, you know, quantify it with reasonable accuracy. And then we say, okay, this is your climate debt to the global south. How do you pay for it? You can pay for it in cash. You can pay for it in kind by literally transferring technology, which includes renewable energy technology, medical technology. It can be research and development to help the global south mobilize its own resources. It could be technical training. It's a combination of contributions that add up to building resilience in the global south and less dependence on loans and charity and removing the structural energy and food and low value added content deficiencies. So each country will decide based on their contribution. Some countries can contribute more in kind, and some countries can contribute more in financial resources, but it has to be a combination globally. I didn't say exactly how the transfer will be done, and this is kind of, I'm hoping that the next short piece I'm writing will illustrate this. At least I've been asked to do this because I said it in a few webinars and I haven't really articulated it fully. By the way, this is a book project that I'm putting together. So you're part of my my group of friends who are helping me think through some of the details. So these are very helpful questions. So a guy by the name of John Maynard Keynes in 1945 was trying to think through how do we redesign the global financial system after World War II to avoid all the mess that happened in between the two wars and so on. And you know, we ended up with not the Keynes plan, but with the American plan, which was the IMF and the World Bank. But Keynes had the third component, which is desperately needed today, and I'm hoping to revive under this reparations framework, which is creating a mechanism whereby we automatically rebalance all the global financial system, whereby the trade deficit countries that today are forced into external debt, forced into austerity, forced into artificially fixing their exchange rate, would be able to rebalance their trade imbalances via what he called the Bancor system or the International Clearing Unit. So that's not a currency that any of us would use on the streets. That's currency that will be rebalanced between central banks. It could be done today via the IMF. The IMF has the special drawing rights, which is sort of an international currency that they use on a very small scale. And there are very strict circumstances that could be opened up to all countries, especially in the global south. So I see kind of a global reparations climate fund operating as a Keynes automatic stabilizer internationally. I'll give you another example of things that we currently use, and we know that they work really well in terms of stabilizing international balances. The Fed has international swap lines with the central bank in Switzerland, the ECB, Japan, but only given exclusively to a handful of privileged countries during the global financial crisis, during the COVID crisis. We know that they stabilized currencies, that they stabilize flows, that they stabilize markets, but are done only exclusively. We want something like that to work internationally automatically. So you can create this mechanism or recreate the Keynes mechanism and use this reparation argument to say, this is how we're going to transfer resources on a permanent basis to create a permanent automatic stabilizer. So I need to fully articulate this, and I'm happy to share drafts and ideas of this to get your feedback.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Naren, do you want to go next?
Yes, thank you, Professor, for the very interesting presentation. It was very civilized. So my question is, you mentioned that we can finance Green New Deal with MMT. I mean, do you mean that all countries should follow MMT framework? And how can a country like Iraq, for example, developing countries, how can they implement that? Is there a guideline, or we're not there yet?
Very, very good question. So one nuance to clarify here is that MMT is not a policy to be implemented. MMT is an analytical approach that helps us figure out how much fiscal policy space a country has. And a country like Iraq has a limited fiscal space. A country like Bolivia has a limited space. A country like the US has a large one. That's what MMT allows us to see. And then MMT allows us to analyze where the structural weaknesses are in the economy, whether they're energy or food or low value added manufacturing. And then it tells us you can afford to invest strategically to increase your resilience in those areas. And when you do, you actually increase your additional spending capacity. MMT also tells us the risk of inflation that we all worry about can be mitigated by taxing and regulating abusive market power domestically and internationally. So MMT is the analytical approach that tells us this is how we can acquire larger economic and monetary sovereignty, even for the smallest countries on the planet. So that's the approach at the national level. The approach at the international level that I tried to tie together here is saying, the situation as we speak right now is very clear. Countries in the global south have very limited space. They can't implement Green New Deals for technological reasons, financial reasons, for the external debt reasons, all of those things, structural trade deficit reasons. But countries in the global south and the global north have the financial capabilities, have the technology, have the resources, and have the moral and ethical responsibility to compensate the global south for it. So in other words, to answer your question specifically, MMT is not something that a country needs to implement. It's an analytical approach that allows us to see, kind of shine a bright light and identify weaknesses and opportunities. Whereas the traditional analytical approach tells us that the possibilities are limited. It's, climate change is there, too bad we can't really do very much about it. Reparations, colonial damage, all of that is awful. It happened a long time ago. Too bad there's nothing we can do about it economically today. It's just unaffordable. And if we attempt to pay reparations or to address climate change on a massive scale, we're going to cause hyperinflation. Where MMT provides the alternative approach that says, not necessarily. Now, there's a way to create hyperinflation, and I guarantee you. And MMT advises us not to do that, especially in the global south. So printing money for the sake of printing money, thinking that it will solve all the problems, is not going to happen. I'll give you one example to illustrate the MMT analysis of hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, for example, since a lot of people use that example. Well, what happened in Zimbabwe? Mugabe decided to redistribute land to native citizens away from white colonial farmers with colonial legacy. which on a political, from a political standpoint, you can, maybe understand that. We're not going to debate the issue there. The problem was the land was given to farmers, quote unquote farmers, who are not interested in farming. They were political allies of the president. They were soldiers. They were not interested. So what happened is production of food literally dropped by almost 50%. The demand for food was still the same. The supply dropped by 50%. So the first trigger was food price inflation. So how do you deal with food price inflation now that your soldiers and officers and government officials can't afford food? Well, you pay them a little more so that they can afford food. And that was the biggest mistake. That accelerated inflation because you just gave a bunch of people extra cash to go to food markets to bid up prices for food items that literally don't exist or are in scarce supply. So that further accelerated the inflation cycle. So that kind of money printing to deal with the real resource problem can never solve it. But had the government accelerated the production of food or imports of food at reasonable prices, that would have taken care of the situation, at least temporarily. And so that's the idea that printing money will solve problems. MMT will be the first one to tell you that it's the real resources that matter. The money printing actually came after the inflation trigger, not causing the inflation trigger. And then after that, of course, you create a scenario where now it's really attractive to cross the border to South Africa, buy lower cost food from South Africa and smuggle it into Zimbabwe to sell at a premium. And when you're doing that, you're getting the military, the police, the border patrol bribed to do it. So now you literally have armed gangs controlling the food market and the gasoline market, taking advantage of the inflation and hyperinflation cycle. And once you have that, it becomes almost impossible to undo those inflation cycles, because not only you're dealing with the scarcity of the product itself, you're dealing with an economic breakdown, but you're dealing with corruption, armed rebellions, and all kinds of things. And this is not unique to Zimbabwe. Cross-border trafficking and inflation is typical in many countries, including my own home country in Tunisia. I'm happy to talk about that for the next 5 hours if you're interested.
Okay, I think John and then Skender.
So let me play devil's advocate for a second. So let's assume your arguments are correct and the global north owes the global south. So here's the question. How likely do you actually think the global north is going to pay any kind of reparations to the global south? And if so, how are they going to be calculated? Who's going to measure them? Who are they going to be paid to? What guarantees are that money or those transfers, whether it's technology or whatever, are going to be used for the purposes that it's going to be used for? In a world where truth and facts are, let's just say, fluid right now, how is all of this going to happen? Because you make a great argument, but at the end of the day, one of the things that I feel like I heard was that this has to be a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach. The world has to band together in some way, shape, or form to put pressure. You mentioned Wall Street and large investment banks. So there's an economic component here, right? And there's an agenda component here. And so just how likely is this really going to happen?
On good days, I'll tell you I'm optimistic. On bad days, I'll tell you I'm pessimistic about this. It's just because the clock is ticking. Without going into good days and bad days, to address one of your points about the logistics of how you actually do this and make sure that it's done the right way. That's why I believe in the concept of truth and reconciliation, because that gets you the grassroots commitment and transparency that you need. Not that all the truth and reconciliation commissions that we had in the last 50, 60 years achieved all the goals that we aspire to, including in Tunisia, but at least the principle is right, that it gets the truth out, it shines a bright light on the real issues, and it points to the right direction. This is going to be, harder than pulling teeth, harder than, anything we've ever accomplished. I'm not naive about this happening just because we have a few protests or we have a couple of prime ministers who are kind of interested in at least considering this. This has to be exposed in academic circles, in policy circles. You have to build a grassroots social movement, environmental movement. What I try to present here is really nothing new. I mean, if you strip this down to its bare essence, I'm not bringing anything new to this discussion. MMT is not new. Reparations is not new. Climate debt is not new. None of these. The Keynes plan is not new. What I'm trying to do is provide a coherent framework that says if we're going to fight for something that has a chance to actually produce a transformative result, let's put all of these pieces together and fight for what I think is the truly most transformative plan. If we have to compromise halfway through that process, we compromise from the ideal. We don't fight for a little bit of climate funds, climate mitigation funds, and then compromise down to $1 billion a year, which is what the climate fund started with $100 billion a year. Now it's, as of last week, I checked, it has $8.5 billion in it. And, we're not going anywhere with $8.5 billion sent to the global south and extracting $2 trillion. So I'm cautiously optimistic because I know all of this is unsustainable. At some point, we're going to have to gravitate to bolder and bigger initiatives. And I'm hoping to provide a framework that maybe somebody will look at. And I'm trying to do what I can to actually share this with policymakers, with UN diplomats, and people who are actually concerned about this thing. And that's all I can share at this point. I am working closely with some developing countries within the UN system who are finally realizing that, the fight they've been fighting on the climate front has been relatively leading to a dead end and trivial in the bigger scheme of things, and are at least interested in moving to a bolder approach. And I'm hoping that they'll be interested in pushing this through the UN system, at least put it on the table. I'm not naive that all of a sudden the US and Europe will say, oh yeah, we should pay for reparations. We forgot about that. This is what it is. I'm hoping to inspire people to fight for something more transformative. I'm not sure if we'll make it, actually. It may be too late already, but well, that's my coping mechanism. I have to do something.
I mean, I guess today is one of the bad days for Fadhel, huh? Like it's too late already. No, but it has to start somewhere. I mean,
sure.
Skender, and then I know Fadhel has a meeting in another 15 minutes, if I'm not missed, 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah, 11:30 my time here.
Yeah, so of Skender, and then I see Alex also had his hand raised, so maybe 2 or maximum 3, and then we can conclude. So Skender, where is he?
Okay, so I'll just ask one of the 10 questions I wanted to ask then.
Good. Go ahead.
So hi, thanks for the talk, and thank you for your energy. It's really inspiring. So
thank you.
I think that's what we need, some optimism. So I'm just going to ask one question because I often hear this, and so I'm just going to ask it. I often hear that the MMT framework does not apply to developing countries, only to developed nations. It does not apply to small and open economies. And when people say this, big concern seems to be, I guess, the deficit, the current account deficit and the trade deficit, and how that must be financed by flows of foreign exchange, which obviously will start to dwindle. And I think this argument ignores one major fact of MMT, which tells you that one thing a currency issuing government can always do is sustain full employment in that currency. So I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that and how you tie that in. Thank you.
Yeah, I thank you for the question. So 2 ways to answer that. One is our colleagues who make that claim that MMT doesn't apply to countries in the global south because of the external constraint. I think it's a question of nuance and maybe miscommunication between the MMT approach and the standard, say, post-Keynesian approach, because there's a lot of post-Keynesians who make that argument, especially in Latin America. And I think it has to do with this particular nuance. That is, our colleagues see the system as is and see the neoliberal structures as is and see it as impossible to move or transform. MMT economists like myself, I see the system as is, but then I talk about how can we build internal resilience to actually relieve that constraint. And you certainly don't do it by printing money left and right. That's why I focus on strategic areas of resilience, starting with food sovereignty and energy sovereignty and long-term investments, strategic investments to allow countries to become more selective in the types of industrializations that they take on and the types of foreign direct investment that they take on, and avoid the race to the bottom and the obsession with tourism revenues, the obsession with export-led growth, because as I said earlier, those are traps, long-term traps. So how do you exit the trap and start build more resilience? I think that's the key MMT approach. And when you have, deep, long face-to-face conversations with post-Keynesians colleagues who have that critique of MMT, they say, oh, if that's what you're talking about, I guess it's possible, right? But it's going to take a long time, and there's a lot of political corruption, and there's a lot of this. And it's not like we ignore all of these things. They're there, but you're not going to transform the system unless you identify the structural weaknesses, design strategic policies, and then fight the corruption, and then shine the bright light on how do we tax and regulate corporate power, domestic and international, to accelerate that transition. I'll give you an example. If we decide in a developing country today, we identified food sovereignty and energy sovereignty as key fundamental problems that we want to address. So we're going to dedicate a portion of the government budget next year away from subsidizing fossil fuels into building more renewables, for example. And we, design our education system to produce the right skills, the engineering skills, and so on. Guess what? Most developing countries today have individuals or companies who have an exclusive license to be the only company or only group of individuals who import gasoline and kerosene and wheat and corn and rice for the country, because these are basic necessities, and those are made exclusive to individuals. Those individuals have a huge economic power because they're technically monopolies, and they have huge political influence. The first thing that they're going to do, if you're building resilience to eliminate their market share, their market power, their political influence, they're going to start producing studies showing that what you're doing is a waste of money, showing that the technology that you're using is obsolete, showing that this is going to cause inflation. And that's the nice opposition. And then they're going to fund opposition parties to eliminate the prime minister or the government who's trying to do this. And in some extreme cases, they'll literally fight you to death, as in harassing individuals and killing labor leaders and social movement leaders who are trying to take away their market share. That's the kind of power that we're talking about. And this is not talking about external geopolitical influence. These are your own internal market forces abusing and blocking the transition to a more resilient economy. Because why wouldn't you? You have exclusive power. Why would you want to give it up to renewable energy or domestic food production to build more resilience? So the traditional approach says the system is as is, and there's nothing we can do about it. MMT at least identifies potential solutions and identifies what are the real obstacles to this. And many of those obstacles are in the political sphere and the market power oligarchy sphere, not because of technical reasons, purely because of technical reasons. So I think it's more nuanced. And again, I'm biased because that's the kind of work I do.
Can I just do one follow-up? So if we talk specifically and pragmatically, for example, you mentioned you're from Tunisia, or we had the question about Iraq earlier. Yeah. Would you see those countries as being able to sustain a job guarantee program if it were to be implemented, let's say, next month? If we say, okay, we have a currency issuing sovereign government, could they implement the job guarantee?
Absolutely, if a job guarantee is designed to build resilience. So for example, if we employ 100,000 people in Tunisia today and we spend whatever amount of money to pay them decent wages, the next question is, what is the risk of inflation from that additional spending? Well, those individuals are free to buy whatever they want with their income. They're going to buy a house, they're going to buy a car, they're going to buy food, transportation, entertainment, whatever it is. Do we have the productive capacity in Tunisia to provide those goods and services that they want? If not, will this create an inflation pass-through effect? And typically the inflation pass-through effect is energy and food in a country like Tunisia, which means, yes, that job guarantee will create the jobs, but it will also apply pressure on your external balance. So my approach for those 100,000 jobs is to dedicate a portion of those jobs in resources to building resilience in the food industry and the energy industry, so that you're spending more, creating more jobs, but you're also preventing the inflation pass-through effect and dealing with the long-term consequences of the structural trade deficit. So that's why spending can't be just random left and right. It has to be strategic, it has to be resilience focused. And that's why I highlight food and energy as the basic areas to begin with. So food sovereignty, energy sovereignty.
So if it weren't for the low-wage export-led export growth, the low-wage export-led companies having the control and the power, this could probably be implemented tomorrow.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you.
All right, so let's move on to Alex. I think Alex has had his hand raised for a while, so go ahead, Alex.
Yes, so thank you for coming and giving us today's lecture. My question is following. Now EU, as you said, is trying to improve their production, forcing companies to maintain more environmentally friendly technologies on during their production. But they also force developing countries to implement the same things in order to participate in the European market and receive money from IMF or ECB. From one hand, it's good. It's like solving the ecological problem, but it's economically impossible to achieve by developing countries to maintain all this thing. So what stands behind this decision? Is it the incompetence of people working there, or is it the fact that developing countries overvalue their capacities, and or maybe is it something behind that?
It's a combination, excuse me, it's a combination of those plus something else behind it. And it's really hard to untangle kind of in the public domain. But as you recognize, the requirement for green technology and higher standards means that now you have to import that technology from the global north, which creates jobs in the global north and further enhances the dependence of the global south, which from an environmental technological perspective is great, but from an economic perspective, it's extractive, right? And we see this across the board. And it starts with food all the way to weapons and green technology and so on. I'll give you an example in terms of what Europe, for example, and the US, Australia, Japan have done, but I'll focus on Europe since all of you are in Europe. Africa and the global south in particular was the breadbasket for Europe during colonial times. After independence, that became a problem because Europe became food dependent on the global south. And some countries in the global south actually started to flux their muscles post-independence because now they have the upper hand in the food market. And that was the red flag for Europe. So Europe introduced CAP, which is the Common Agricultural Policy, which if you go back to the transcripts, if you go back to the speeches by the MPs across Europe, was very clear. It was a post-colonial strategy to reduce Europe's dependence on the global south and to teach them a lesson. Who's the boss here? And that was it. That was the end of agriculture in the global south by subsidizing European farmers and building food sovereignty and food supremacy in Europe. Now you invade, the rest of the global south food market and you displace millions of farmers across the global south. What do those farmers do? They leave the villages and move to the cities looking for jobs, Well, guess what? What a coincidence. Low value added manufacturing jobs that are being outsourced from Europe, obsolete technologies are waiting for you in the manufacturing industries, in the tourism industry, race to the bottom across the global north, the global south. So these are structural post-colonial issues. So the part that I didn't have a chance to talk about at length is the colonial extraction model continued post-colonial via this would be an example of creating the food dependence in the global south on the global north. So that gives you an idea of how intertwined these issues are.
Thank you. Peyton, okay, very quickly, one last question then.
Thank you. And if you don't have time, that's completely understandable.
I have time. It's just I have the president and the provost waiting for me. They can wait. This is more important.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. And the presentation overall has been phenomenal. I was just wondering, so I fully agree with you in your argument on what kind of state policies need to be taken and smart state spending, absolutely. But through what avenue do you communicate these tactics to actual governments? Like how do you go to governments in the global south and tell them this is what we recommend to you without doing so in a condescending type of manner, you know?
Very good question. Well, one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that many governments around the global south have realized that something is not working. Something fundamentally wrong is happening here. Tourism disappeared, foreign direct investment disappeared. All of these potential lifelines that we've been told will solve these problems have backfired. So everybody's been asking, how do we build more resilient economies? I mean, how do we actually establish that? And that opened up some possibilities for MMT economists who have been talking about this type of resilience to actually talk to governments in different places in the global south. And not just MMT economists, but economists who have been talking about food sovereignty as an exclusive thing, or energy sovereignty, or climate change activists who have been fighting for more resilient green infrastructure and so on. So all of these coalitions are now being heard by governments. And we told you that you can't run a country that's exclusively dependent on all of these things. So I am personally working with networks of economists who are trying to apply pressure on the African Union via those governments, UN ambassadors from the global south who recognize that climate change policy has been dragged too slowly, is not really putting a dent in this thing. And these are countries that are on the front lines of climate change. These are countries that will literally be the first waves of climate refugees, small islands that will disappear in the next few decades. So they know that something massive needs to happen in order to address the situation. So they're looking for bold, transformative solutions. They're not looking for, let's stack this to pay for that, let's beg for a little bit of charity. They know those things are not going to work. So there's some hope, some possibilities. More people are listening, at least are interested in hearing this, but it doesn't mean we can celebrate tomorrow and say we got a global south movement and nobody's going to oppose it. There's still opposition in the global south, primarily by countries that have massive oil and gas resources, countries that recently discovered even more oil and gas. They're saying, oh, you guys have a problem. We've discovered our wealth. We can fix this on our own, which is a problem because what I tried to show today is that even countries with the biggest oil resources are still trapped in the same economic development trap. And that's been my approach with those countries is tell them, it's great that you have oil and gas, but it's not going to transform your economy simply because you're exporting crude oil and gas. You're still trapped in the same. You're still going to import more and more expensive petrochemicals and gasoline and kerosene if you rely on tourism and all of these non-circular economy type of resources.
Thank you. So
Thank you.
Thank you.
since you did say that you're going to make someone wait, so if I could just quickly ask you one question, if that's all right. I was also curious about your take on Sustainable Development Goals as a framework to offer, or rather a framework that offers partnership between the private sector and essentially the public sector to meet these sustainable goals, right? Do you find it useful, or do you think that it's just another sort of a check mark on a box to include the private sector? I was just curious to know about your.
I think it's been a helpful framework for getting the conversation to here, to where we are today, but it hasn't been transformative in the sense of getting policy action to really, not only meet those goals but exceed those goals. I think it was helpful in the beginning to get us at least thinking about the right targets. But I think at this point, it's not sufficient. It's not transformative enough to get us where we need to be. For example, if you think of the European Green Deal, the $1 trillion over the next 10 years, if you look at the details of the proposal, most of it, they're hoping for private sector financing that thing. It's not really governments, which is beyond laughable. It's actually dangerous to even consider that a proposal. But somehow it's a big deal. That's how bad the situation are. So when you ask me if you're optimistic or pessimistic, well, there you go. We're not even close in terms of what some of our leaders are thinking.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Andrea, would you like to say something before we leave? Because we have a lot to chew on in terms of information and ideas. So Andrea, would you?
I just want to thank everyone who joined us today, and a special thanks to Dr. Fadhel Kaboub for this inspiring contribution to our program. And I'm sure our students will take home quite valuable ideas. If we had another 5 hours, I would love to continue discussing, especially how to deal with the powerful private interests that are behind what we label bad economics. You mentioned, for example, how privatization has been presented as a way to fund governments, and we know how behind that was the private interest of entering into money-making sectors. Sure. And something similar could be said about tourism. So, that would be for the next time, perhaps. And thanks for making reference to Keynes and his plan. John Maynard Keynes died 75 years yesterday, 21st of April, just a few weeks after being appointed the first British governor of the newly formed IMF and of the World Bank. So on this note, again, thank you very much, Fadhel, for your contribution to our program, and we look forward to the next opportunity. Thank you all.
It's been fun. Great questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, and good evening to all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the information. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.